Hello and welcome to a learner lecture at Arizona State University, IFT 381, Fall Semester 2023. Before we get started, let's define what we'll be covering today. And to do that, first we'll do a brief introduction to the team. We will discuss the event and the parties involved. Then we'll take a look exactly what happened. We'll get into some more of the details of the event. And to close out the lecture, we will look at some considerations of actions that were taken, and finally closing out with thoughts and questions. The team. I'm a team of one performing this lecture. My name is Jason Merritt. I attend Arizona State from Charleston, South Carolina. Currently, I am enjoying a career in IT. I found my career to be primarily focused on virtual desktop infrastructure in the healthcare space. I've done everything from support desk engineer, currently operating as a solutions architect. And probably most important fact about myself, I own 3 cats. Everyone seems to like to know that. So without further delay, let's get into the topic at hand. Today, we're going to talk about the Plex database breach that occurred. And before we talk about the actual breach, let's discuss, well, what is Plex? Plex is a software company that offers both streaming platform and the ability to do your own hosted media server. I saw this breach and I thought it was interesting because this one actually personally impacted me. I have a Plex server at my house that I use to run music and movies. I've got that hooked up to some network attached storage, and I do a little bit of network segmentation to keep all that safe. And we'll touch on some of those things a little bit later in the presentation. But for now, we'll stay on the breach. This one occurred in 2022. And as you can see, I put a bullet point in there that the Identity Theft Resource Center reported in 2022 alone, there were 1,802 database breaches that occurred. Now, they didn't define what a database breach was in every scenario, but to put that into perspective, that's an average of 4 a day. So these attacks are on the rise, and what are companies doing to prevent these attacks? Just Plex alone was 30 million user accounts. And I found myself asking, well, how much of the user base is that? In 2023, Plex was still reporting 16 million active users. So that you can safely assume that in just one breach of 2022, Plex lost majority of their users' data. So what actually happened? We're calling it a breach and we're calling it a database breach. A third party was able to gain access to a proprietary Plex database that housed sensitive information like user data, usernames, and emails, and most importantly, password data. The next 2 bullets you have on screen I thought were interesting and not just specific to the Plex breach. These were 2 commonalities that I noticed when I was researching my topics, that during these incidents, the companies like to quickly state whether or not financial information was compromised. And then the second thing that I noticed, they don't typically say exactly how they were compromised. There's vague that they used an attack vector that they have since fixed and did not state exactly what that was. So that brought 2 questions to my mind of, while it's positive that it was no financial information was lost, could the simple leak of a username and password lead to Plex users becoming compromised on other services they use? Because I'm sure some of us use the same emails and password across platforms. And second, should these companies be required to report what attack vector was used to ensure people can safeguard against them in the future? Now, getting down into the actual data and what Plex was doing to prevent an attack as such, they were using encryption. And we all know encryption is, simply speaking, of taking your password, putting it through a series of scrambling steps, and making it harder to read, taking plain text and encrypting it. They were doing hashing with bcrypt using a salting technique, and now that's a lot of things we need to break down. And hashing is just a computer algorithm to transfer your password into a random series of numbers and letters. That's effective because as a hacker, you need to know the algorithm to be able to reverse the password and figure out what it was. Salting is something that I had not heard until researching this, is when they're appending a random number of letters to either like the beginning or end of a password in that hashing process. So Plex publicly came out and said that they use bcrypt to do hashing with salting and ensure the users that passwords would be virtually impossible to crack. It would take days, months, or even years. Because the bcrypt is based on a cipher called Blowfish that was developed in '93, and to this day, that cipher has never been broken. So if you were a Plex user, knowing your passwords were stolen, but they were hashed using a cipher that has never been compromised, would you change your passwords, or do you rely on comfortably knowing that they have the correct security protocols in place? And in a data breach like this, does it bring to mind your own password management? Do you find yourself using a common password across multiple platforms? And looking backwards now at the breach, we can kind of talk about things they did correctly and things that maybe could have had room for improvement. I think Plex reacted appropriately with rapid user notifications. They responded within 24 hours, informing their user community, whereas some companies like Cash App have waited 4 months to release information as such. We touched on it a little bit earlier. Data segmentation. I think segmentation in general was a good practice in both their database tables, the network segmentation, and just help to minimize damage. And then encryption was another thing that they did correctly. Room for improvement, you can also talk about encryption. They only had the passwords encrypted. Should other data have been encrypted, such as the emails, the usernames? Is that data encryption and reduction in performance doing the encryption worth the security focused mindset? And could they have put something in place to maybe automatically prevent this, such as a host intrusion prevention system, where you're able to define a baseline for behavior on the network, and if it goes out of baseline, action can be taken, such as dropping packets, stopping services, etc., etc. And final thoughts on this Plex database breach. We'll kind of talk about, well, I'm not a Plex employee, I don't work there. What can I do as a user to keep myself safe? I think one easy one is harden your logon privileges using things such as multi-factor authentication. We're all familiar with Arizona State's Duo Push system. And then I want to just touch on segmentation again because I think that's a really important one, for your own home networks and in enterprise practices. And then database safeguards. What can they do post breach? Would documenting all the logs be an effective step in preventing future breaches? And should Plex have mandated password resets instead of suggesting password resets for users, knowing the data was compromised? And I leave you with 2 questions on screen that you can answer. But other than that, if you'd like to learn more about this topic, I have references at the end of the slide. But I thank you for your time and good luck in the rest of the semester.